Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be covering how to make a visual approach that transitions to either a traffic pattern or circuit to any airport in Flight Sim. I'll be covering flight planning aspects such as when to start the descent from cruise altitude and how to approach the airport. I'll talk about how to estimate distances and how to choose a runway for landing. And finally, I'll cover how to fly the traffic pattern within the limitations of the sim. The irony is that in a lot of ways, a visual approach is a lot harder than an instrument approach because you don't have a published procedure to follow that tells you exactly where to go and when to descend. In fact, the reason I'm doing this video in the first place is because I've had more than a few comments asking me how to get into the right position for landing under visual flight rules. The answer, for me anyways, is to plan ahead of time, and I'll show you how to do that in this video. Even if you've got a ton of experience in Flight Sim, you'll probably learn a thing or two along the way as well. And if you're using either the built-in ATC or something like VATSIM that has real live controllers, you're gonna have to follow what they're going to tell you. But this video should help you understand what they're asking of you and how to follow their directions. Finally, before we get going, just a really quick reminder that what I'll be covering is not necessarily representative of how you would do it in real life. This is what works well in the sim for me and nothing more. With all of that said, let's fly. I'm still exploring World Update 8, so I've set up a flight in Australia from Canberra all the way over to Shell Harbour, which is just to the south of Sydney. By default, Flight Sim set my flight type to VFR with a direct GPS route. I'm gonna leave it like that, but flying in a straight line is kind of boring, so I've added one waypoint to the middle to a place where I've actually been myself, because I'm curious to see what it looks like in the sim. As for my destination, I can see when I zoom in that there are two runways that are basically perpendicular to each other. They're both sufficiently long for the caravan. The first one is 5,500 feet, the other one's 10,000 feet. So either way, on my approach, I'll be able to choose whichever runway I want to land on. I won't decide which runway I'm going to use until I'm starting my approach and I can get the latest wind conditions. What I have done though is I've jotted down the headings for both runways so that I have them at a glance. The other bit of information that I need is the altitude of the airport, and the only way to get that is to go into the nav log right at the top on the right. Once the screen opens up, you just scroll all the way down however many waypoints you added, and that last waypoint is actually going to be the airport. In this case, it's telling me that the runway is at an altitude of 25 feet, so I'm going to take a note of that as well so that when I'm coming in to land, I have it quickly at hand to know at what altitude the ground is. Everything else on the navlog, to be completely honest, is kind of useless. It adds a waypoint for when to start your descent, but it doesn't take into account the descent rate that I want to use, or if there are any mountains in the area as well. It's just using a very straight line to do my descent, and for that reason, I'm not going to refer to it at all once I'm flying. Speaking of mountains though, the next thing I'm actually going to check is the terrain. This is one occasion where I'll actually duck out of the sim and go onto skyvector.com to get a better visual representation of the terrain between my departure and arrival points. I can map my flight plan out here if I want with all of the different waypoints, but based on my track and flight sim, I can see that I'm just going to be skirting to the north of the highest of the mountain peaks, so I don't need to worry about them for my flight. Shell Harbour itself is at sea level, but I can also see that there's some terrain up to 2,000 feet to the west of the airport. I'll keep that in mind when I start my descent, and I might need to use a shallower descent rate to start, and then use a steeper one once I've gone past the highest point of the terrain to make up for lost time. Either way, I've also jotted down that note for my approach so that I don't get too close to the ground as I'm coming in to land. Alright, with all of that set up, I'm ready to start my flight. Before I move on to the approach, I want to remind you, if you get some value from this video, to please make sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so to get more Microsoft Flight Sim content. I publish a new video every 2 weeks with tips, tricks, and tutorials for newcomers to the world of Flight Sim. I'm already in flight at my cruise altitude of 5,500 feet, and I'm at the point where I need to start thinking about how I'm going to approach the airport. A visual approach like this can be broken down into 3 phases. The first is a descent down to 1,500 feet above ground level, the second is maneuvering to enter the traffic pattern, and the last is flying the traffic pattern down to the runway. Let's start by looking at how to execute that first part, descending from cruise down to about 1,500 feet above ground level. I like a slow and steady descent rate, and I'll usually use around 500 feet per minute since it's a speed that makes it really easy to calculate when to start descending. Things are a little bit more complicated in my case for this flight though, because the ground below me is actually at about 2,000 feet. If I were to start descending right now at 500 feet per minute, I'd probably end up a little bit too close to the ground before the terrain drops off near the airport. What I'll do is I'll start descending at around 300 feet per minute, and as I see that I'm getting closer to the terrain dropping off, I'll increase that descent rate to 500 feet per minute, and then finally to 700 feet per minute just to catch up on that time when I was descending a little slower. So the first thing I do is I take the thousands of feet that I need to lose and I divide it by the descent rate to get how long it's actually going to take me to descend from my cruise altitude. I'm at 5,500 feet right now and I want to get to 1,500, so that means I need to lose 4,000 feet. I take the 4,000 feet, I divide it by my descent rate of 500 feet per minute, and that's going to give me 8 minutes, which is the time it's going to take me to get down to my target altitude. The easiest way to know when you're 8 minutes out from the airport is actually to have a look at the ETE, or estimated time en route number, that you can see on the multifunction display on the right. So when the ETE hits 8 minutes, I can start to descend, and just like magic, I'll arrive at the airport at the exact altitude that I was targeting. The really neat thing about having the estimated time en route displayed is that you can always make adjustments either to your airspeed or your descent rate so that you arrive at exactly the altitude that you want to. This is all assuming, of course, that you're flying an airplane with a glass cockpit. If you're not, or the airport isn't your next waypoint before arriving, you need to take one more step to calculate the actual distance at which you need to start to descend to be at the right altitude when you want. You can do that using something called the 60-to-1 rule that says that for every 60 knots of airspeed, you're going to travel 1 nautical mile over the ground per minute. If you're descending at 90 knots, that's 1.5 nautical miles per minute, 120 knots is 2 nautical miles per minute, and so on. I keep the table I'm showing on screen handy when I'm flying so that I can quickly calculate that distance required to descend. The other thing to keep in mind though is you're going to want to start slowing down during the descent so that you're close to the flaps extension speed as you're arriving at the airport. In the Grand Caravan, that's 125 knots, and I'll probably average something like 135 knots the whole way down. The nearest multiple of 60 to that airspeed is 120, which means I'll be descending at something just over 2 nautical miles per minute. And 8 minutes of descent time times 2 nautical miles per minute means I need to start descending somewhere around 60 nautical miles. I'm actually going to start descending something around 20 nautical miles out just to give myself a little bit of a buffer, since my calculation is really just a rule of thumb. It isn't completely exact. And as we can see, I'm coming up on the airport now in the distance, and I'm just about at my target altitude of 1,500 feet above ground level. That means it's time to start the next phase, which is how I'm going to join the traffic pattern. I need to get the latest weather and wind info to figure that out though. The easiest way to do that if you're using live weather is to bring up the weather menu, click the METAR button, and choose your destination airport from the drop-down. If there's no METAR available for the airport that you're landing at, the next best thing is to check if there's an ATIS frequency that you can tune into, and if you can't get that either, the next best thing is to actually just enable the wind option on the primary flight display. I have it up right now, and you can tell the wind direction and how many knots it's blowing just at a glance. That'll be good enough as long as you're relatively close to the airport. Ideally, you want to land as much into the wind as possible to avoid a crosswind and reduce the distance that you actually need once you're on the ground. The wind is blowing from the south for my landing, and I've got 2 runways, one on heading 1634 and another on 0826. Runway 16 is almost straight into the wind, so I'll land on that one. I need to figure out how I'm going to get into the right spot to enter the traffic pattern for that runway though. For the most part, runways have left-hand traffic patterns, which means all your turns are going to be to the left. If I was arriving parallel to the runway I was going to land on, all I would do is offset myself by about half a mile to the right of the runway and join the downwind leg directly. I am arriving basically perpendicular to the runway that I'm going to be landing on though, so I've got to do a little bit of extra work to get into that right spot to join the traffic pattern. What I do in those cases is I overfly the runway by about 500 feet like I'm doing right now. That's going to give me a good view of the runway I'm going to be landing on, the windsock so I can double check the wind direction, as well as if it's a busy airport if I'm flying online. This is also when I'd start configuring the airplane for approach by extending the flaps to the approach position and increasing the prop RPM, but the exact things that you'll have to do are going to be different based on what airplane that you're flying. The traffic pattern's almost always flown at 1,000 feet above ground level, so I'm going to descend the last little bit now to be at the right altitude for flying the downwind leg. The next step is to start a right-hand turn to loop around to the far end of the runway that I'm going to be landing on. That's going to allow me to enter the traffic pattern at a 45-degree angle, and it'll make it easy to turn parallel to the runway. In the real world, you'd be keeping an eye on where the runway is relative to your position by just looking over your shoulder. That's a little bit difficult to do in the sim. The PI focus button is supposed to be there to help with that, but it really only seems to work about 80% of the time. Sometimes it'll latch on to something else other than the runway that you're landing on. What you can do though is use the multifunction display to see where and how far you are from the runway. If you adjust the zoom level, you'll be able to have a pretty good idea of how far out you are. It's not ideal, but I feel like for the sim it's acceptable just because of the limitations of looking around. This is where a VR headset would probably come in useful if you've got one though. Now we're reached at the final stage of the approach, which is flying the traffic pattern down to the ground. The downwind leg is where we're starting right now, parallel to the runway. Base is when we're going to be perpendicular to the runway and we've made our first left-hand turn. And final is when we're aligned with the runway and we've made our final left-hand turn. I like to fly the downwind leg somewhere between half a mile and a full mile parallel to the runway. The bigger and faster the airplane that I'm flying, the more distance I'm going to give myself. Obviously though, you can make changes to that in the sim. You can be a little bit further out or a little bit closer in, whatever you're most comfortable with. Also, don't forget to adjust for wind on every single leg of the traffic pattern. In my case, it's going to be blowing me slightly away from the runway, so I'm going to adjust my heading so that I crab into the wind just a little bit so that I stay parallel to the runway the whole time I'm on the downwind leg. I'm maintaining 1,000 feet of altitude the whole time I'm on the downwind leg, and once I go past the runway threshold in a slower airplane, I'm actually going to start descending again. In a faster plane like I'm flying today though, I wait a few extra seconds to start descending because I like to give myself a little bit more space on final so that I have more time to align myself properly with the runway. Otherwise, things just happen way too quickly. I've covered this in depth in other landing videos, but what I try to do is follow the 3-to-1 rule, which says that for every 1,000 feet of altitude, you travel 3 nautical miles over the ground. For traffic pattern landings, I cut that in half, so I need to be at 500 feet when I'm 1.5 miles out from the end of the runway. Like that, I know I'll have a nice and stable descent down to the ground. I'm going to start my turn onto the base leg now, and once again, I'm cheating a little bit by using the multifunction display to know when I'm 1.5 miles from the runway. Once I've rolled out of the turn, I'm going to extend the flaps to the final landing position. If I wait until I'm too low to the ground, it's going to destabilize my approach because there's going to be lift that's going to get generated. So it's better to do that earlier so that you have a little bit more time to adjust. I'm a little bit lower than I would have liked, but I should be able to compensate as I turn towards the final leg and align myself with the runway. I'm just going to shallow up my descent rate for just a couple seconds. For the turn to base to final, I keep an eye on where the runway is, either with the POI focus button, or I'll just pan left to have an eye on where the actual runway threshold is. But even then, I have to remember to compensate for wind. If it's blowing even just a little bit from left to right across the runway, I need to start my turn sooner. And if it's blowing from right to left, I need to start my turn actually a little bit later because the turn won't need nearly as much distance over the ground. In general though, start the turn relatively slowly, keep an eye on where the runway threshold is, and make any adjustments if you need to. If you need to increase the bank angle to make the runway, you can, and if you need less of a bank angle, you can shallow it up a little bit as well. The idea is really to make the turn as smoothly as you can because you're flying a lot closer to the stall speed with very low power settings while you're descending and the flaps fully extended, so you have to be careful about very steep turns. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about the final leg. I've covered that in depth in a bunch of other videos recently, so I'll point you to those in the show notes instead. One neat thing about Shell Harbor is that there's an old 747 parked off just to the side of the runway. We can just make it out there in the distance. That airplane is now a museum piece, and you can actually get on the airplane in real life, so if you're ever in the area, I really recommend you go check it out. Even in the sim, it's pretty cool to have it there, and you can taxi right up to it and go check it out if you want to. And that's all there is to doing a VFR approach with a traffic pattern. Hopefully you learned something useful for your next flight, and in the meantime, please feel free to leave any comments below if you have any questions or clarifications you'd like. And if you got some value from this video, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe as well. All right, I'm going to be getting back to exploring Australia in the sim and visiting some of my favorite spots from having lived there for 2 years, so I'll see you in the next video.